I've been following the avian influenza outbreak since 2022, and while the media is finally starting to pay attention to it, there's one thing they still aren't talking about: just how infected poultry flocks are exterminated. The most common method is horrifying, and most veterinarians do not believe that it is ethical or humane, but the American Veterinary Medical Association continues to legitimize it. How did it come to be used? In 2019, the AVMA, in a cooperative agreement with the USDA, released its first edition of the Guidelines for the Depopulation of Animals. This document set policy related to the mass extermination of animals during emergencies and infectious disease outbreaks. And the USDA then allowed for taxpayer-funded bailouts to corporations that exterminated their animals using these methods. Since 2022, we have spent $1.7 billion to deal with avian influenza on poultry farms. And now we have spent more than $430 million combating bird flu on dairy farms. One of the methods codified for pigs and poultry was ventilation shutdown plus. This is when they seal up buildings, pump in heat, and wait for the animals inside to die. This was a method to be used in constrained circumstances only. But this classification meant that if producers failed to put plans in place to use less cruel methods, such as whole house gassing or foam, they could get bailouts for using this method. A failure to plan for emergencies could constitute a constrained circumstance. How do you end the lives of hundreds of thousands to millions of avian influenza infected birds as quickly as possible? Extermination using ventilation shutdown plus is banned in the European Union. One less cruel method is using high expansion nitrogen foam. This is large bubbles of nitrogen gas that cause the animals to fall unconscious in a few seconds and pass away a few minutes later. Does this cost more money? Yes, but the corporations that use VSD are the largest corporations, bringing in billions of dollars in revenue and paying their executives millions of dollars in compensation packages. They have the resources to put plans in place to use less cruel methods. For example, Cal-Maine Foods is the nation's largest egg producer, and they received $44 million in taxpayer subsidized bailouts after they exterminated their birds using VSD+. Meanwhile, their stock price increased 220% since 2022, and their revenue increased by 700% in the past year. In another example, Tyson Foods' revenue was $13 billion in 2023, and their CEO, Donnie King, made $13 million in compensation. They also used VSD Plus to exterminate their avian influenza infected flocks, and they received $29.7 million in taxpayer subsidized bailouts. And the AVMA just quietly released their new draft of the Guidelines for the Depopulation of Animals. They never sent out a notice to their members letting them know veterinarians have until January 30th to submit their comments. What does this new draft say? The former categories of preferred, recommended in constrained circumstances, and not recommended have been replaced with Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 categories. Tier 1 methods should be used preferentially and result in rapid loss of consciousness. Tier 2 methods may be considered only when the circumstances of the emergency constrain the ability to reasonably implement a Tier 1 method, or when Tier 1 methods are unavailable. These methods have moderate to limited evidence available to demonstrate rapid loss of consciousness or have other constraints that do not support their prioritization to Tier 1. Tier 3 methods have limited to no evidence to support their use, or evidence may be contrary to good animal welfare. Tier 3 should be considered only when circumstances preclude the reasonable implementation of any Tier 1 or Tier 2 methods, and when the risk of doing nothing is likely to have a reasonable chance of resulting in significantly more animal suffering than that associated with the proposed depopulation method. In the new draft, ventilation shutdown plus is listed as a Tier 3 method for pigs and a Tier 2 method for poultry birds. But many questions still remain. Will Tier 2 and Tier 3 methods still receive USDA indemnity payments when they're used? Should the AVMA guidelines recommend that producers who fail to put plans in place to use Tier 1 methods not be eligible for bailouts? Should the veterinary profession even be legitimizing Tier 2 and Tier 3 methods? Should our role be instead to set the standard for animal welfare and demand that producers put plans in place to use less cruel methods? What if we stated ventilation shutdown plus is not recommended? We could list these not recommended methods in order of least cruel to most cruel and outline the animal welfare concerns associated with each method. Remember, even if the AVMA lists a method as not recommended, producers can still use it. But under current systems, they would not get bailout money. Does legitimizing cruel methods like ventilation shutdown plus only harm our profession's reputation as caring advocates for animals? Do the AVMA's policies only enable the large, intensive, antiquated animal protein production methods that could create the next pandemic? Production methods that harm animal welfare, public health, and our food security? Let me know what you think. If you are an AVMA veterinarian, will you join me in submitting comments by January 30th? We will also have some letters to the AVMA and legislators that you can sign. If you would like to join a discussion session about these new guidelines, please send an email to info@ourhonor.org.